Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from Job's 19th chapter. And Job belongs in the category of Old Testament wisdom literature. More specifically, it can be classified as a theodicy, which explores or explains the relationship of suffering to the righteous. And the latter element, the suffering, cannot be understated in Job's case. He was a man in the midst of prosperity, upright in walk, perfect before Yahweh has declared in verse 1:8, and all of a sudden, just the intensity and the acceleration of the calamities which visit him inexplicably, and because there's no cause for any reasonable cause for this, he attempts to make sense of the sudden and total suffering. He was inflicted with boils, he lost all his worldly wealth, he lost his sons, so he really lost it all. So the exaggeration element cannot be applied in the case of Job and righteous and suffering. And the narrative consists of him and his comforters, friends by various names. There's dialogue to struggle to make sense of it, and the protagonist and namesake of the book is Job, and now most of the cases the protagonist of any work of canonical literature is Yahweh or Elohim. And but what we have to understand is that a lot of the things that they say are their own thoughts. They're not, strictly speaking, derived from Elohim. So we do want to bear this in mind, but Job alone has a pressing need for the presence of Yahweh to make sense of his inexplicable and total suffering. And he does, of course, accommodate his request and visits him, vindicates him while rebuking him, but restores him twofold to measurable prosperity. So the moral of the story is that God's delays are not God's denials. Now, in the I earlier mentioned that the narrative consists of an exchange of chapters whereby Job or one of his comforters, we're going to touch on the nature of their comfort momentarily, but dialogues, so they're speaking to each other and trying to make sense of it all. And the 19th chapter occurs in between the musings of Bildad and Zophar in the 20th chapter. So this is Job speaking. And Job answered and said, "How long would you grieve my life and crush me with words?" So the nature of his friend's advice and tidbits and insights on the suffering he was enduring, which they could only visibly behold, yet not truly experience, was that he had brought it upon himself. There was some secret sin that he did, and his sin had found him out, and that is an archaic and simplistic theology prevalent throughout human nature. And yet these are this will make more sense as we progress in the narrative. But the idea is that when we see a brother in trouble, we can either offer words of hope and encouragement or blame it on them without investigating the cause. So we really owe it to the people we encounter in our spiritual walks to investigate their ails. "These 10 times you have insulted me. Shamelessly you attacked me." So Job's keeping track. According to his count, by now they had insulted him 10 times, and those were stinging enough to register in his brain and frequent enough for him to keep track of. And shamelessly was how they did it. So he's in the midst of his humiliation, and he's surrounded by friends who don't offer comforting answers nor affirm correct answers in relation to his suffering, nor offer him words of hope or encouragement, and they have seemingly no shame, even though he's in the midst of shame, surrounded by it. He has boils on his skin. "Even if I have truly gone astray, my straying remains with me." So as I earlier alluded to, the archaic theological notion that suffering is a response to sin is, broadly speaking, correct. The fall of man precipitated disease and every deterioration in nature which Adam's progeny has known, yet it is not very often those who suffer are sinned against, and quite often are sinners themselves. They reap what they sow karmically, but it's too simplistic a notion because no two situations are exactly alike. And so the point of Job's sin is that he did not sin to suffer, but he sinned in his suffering. He's essentially guilty of the sin of self-righteousness. If indeed you would exalt yourselves above me and plead against me my reproach. So Job has a longing for and a frequently expressed desire to present his petition in the court of Elohim because he's convinced that this is his doing and he demands an explanation. Now, one of the principles of fair jurisprudence is a trial and a whole process through which one who is wronged may go through. But the Almighty, as I said earlier, his delays are not his denial. He does eventually accommodate his request and teaches him the lessons within many lessons. Know then that Eloha has overthrown me, and he has surrounded me with his net. Eloha is an unusual translation in the Hebrew Old Testament, and the most common form is Elohim, which is a plurality, yet it loosely translates as what most English translators erroneously translate as God. But Eloha is singular, so he's not naming Yahweh, but he's perhaps alluding to him. It's the most plausible conjecture. See, I cry violence, but I am not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no justice. So he's making his ailments known, not only his ailments, but his desire to petition the Almighty for an explanation, because Job was unaware of the dialogue between the adversary and Yahweh, which prompted his whole sufferings. Essentially, in the first two chapters, Satan essentially tempts Yahweh into letting him destroy the faith of a servant whom Yahweh had trust in, and Yahweh does accommodate his request. So he, strictly speaking, did not visit the ails on them, but he did permit them to come. See, I cry he has fenced up my way, and I do not pass over, and he has placed darkness in my paths. So in other words, he's completely obstructing him. He's an object without whom moving or progressing or even existing becomes a hindrance to, because of this force which he envisions as somehow set against him. But Yahweh does, as we've earlier mentioned and will perhaps continue to mention, does come through in the end. He has stripped me of my esteem and taken the crown from my head. So this is the second of several he verses which begin in he. So he's directing it to his imagined antagonist, which is Elohim. And he's essentially humiliated him and taken the crown from his head. Now Job was a man in great standing. He was the richest and most respected and sought out man in the East. He lived in what corresponds to an Edomite territory, and yet all of a sudden that is instantly evaporating. So the lesson is that worldly wealth, it can instantly evaporate, and it's no substitute for faith and integrity, which Job did maintain even though he lost every item of worldly wealth. The lesson we may profitably deduce from Job is, even if we were to be inflicted with suffering so inexplicably and thoroughly, is that the adversary can take away our lives, he can take away our health, he can take away our wealth, but he cannot take away our faith or our integrity. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone, and uproots my hope like a tree. So the latter end of the verse is an interesting analogy whereby he envisions Yahweh uprooting, which was a common agricultural practice for any plant whose life was detrimental to the agricultural output. And like a tree, he specifies, so that was a different process altogether. But the idea of being an essential hindrance and obstacle is once more reiterated. And he kindled his wrath against me, and he counts me as one of his enemies. So Job had this misconstrued conception because he had always been there for Yahweh, and now when he needed him most, Yahweh was seemingly not there for him. But Yahweh does eventually accommodate his urgency. But he was in the midst of wrath. He was now, the Almighty exists in perfect paradox, and being loving, completely loving, yet perfectly capable of issuing wrathful retribution to fallen humanity is part of his profound paradoxical perfections. His companies come together, and they cast up their way against me, and encamp all around my tent. By companies we may imagine to be angels, and he had the misconstrued conception that the invisible entities, spiritual entities around him were angels, when they were in fact demons, who are the fallen angels who earned their station by succumbing to Lucifer's rebellion. But the idea of being surrounded and helplessly so is alluded to in the verse. He has removed my brothers far away from me, and my friends are completely estranged from me. So Job was seemingly bereft of any affectionate relationship, because his wife had advised him to curse Yahweh and die at the conclusion of the first chapter, and his children were dead. The obstacle they were resting under in collapsed, the architectural obstacle, and crushed them, and others were the victim of Sabian raiders. So he wasn't speaking figuratively nor in exaggeration when he said that he had lost his children and his brothers. Now he was bereft of any companionship when he needed it most, above all from Yahweh. And friends are completely estranged from me. He considered these comforters friends at one point, and they were speaking as though they were estranged from him. Complete lack of empathy for his situation, with a stubborn insistence that he had somehow merited it. My near ones have fallen away, and my close friends have forgotten me. The guest in my house and my female servants reckon me for a stranger. I am a foreigner in their eyes. Now, Job, we remember, was covered in boils, so he wouldn't have been physically recognizable. So once more, he's not speaking in jest or exaggeration. I have called my servant, but he gives no answer. I have to beg him with my mouth. So Job was conditioned to be at the command of servants, and he occupied a superior socioeconomic position and standing in the land from which he hailed, which was the town of Uz, which roughly corresponds with what would become Edomite territory. Now, the dating of Job is somewhat mysterious. It is the earliest chronologically written work of canonical literature, and it may have origins as old as the patriarchs, yet Job is also mentioned in Genesis 46:13, but that's ultimately a speculative venture. We're not going to... The one thing we do know about who Job was and when he was is that we don't know. We do know who he was. I misspoke earlier. My spirit is strange to my wife, and my kindness to the children of my own body. Now, his wife had survived him, and she issues perhaps the line of advice most of us would follow if similarly afflicted, to curse Yahweh and die. So he's trying to make sense of it, and he wants to retain his faith in Yahweh, but demands an answer, and that is an implicit act of faithlessness. All my intimate friends loathe me, and those whom I love have turned away against me. My bones cling to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. So that he is an emaciated being, physically speaking. Remember, he was afflicted with sores and boils, and so he was once in health and prosperity, instantly evaporated. Show grace to me, O you, my friends, for the hand of Eloha has struck him. So if he cannot count on Elohim, or Eloha, he should at least be able to count on his friends who the Almighty accepted, and a friend in the truest sense of the word will always be there for a friend. Why do you persecute me like El, and are not satisfied with my flesh? So he was essentially accusing them of being in a cosmic conspiracy with the author of, or who he thought was the author of his evils. Unbeknownst to him, it was in fact the adversary. The reader is privy to the machinations of the opening two verses, but Job was very much not. Or his friends, which partially explains their ignorant answers. Oh, that my words were written down. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. So he's at death's door, and the natural man has a longing for immortality, and the faith that there is a life after the grave was a cardinal tenet of what became Orthodox Judaism. And there are, the word resurrection never explicitly appears in the Old Testament, but the foundation for what became a central item of Christianity was very much laid in there, and this is the earliest chronological allusion to the resurrection. We're actually going to read the verse before we contact on that. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and to the end shall stand over the earth. So he has both an accurate premonition of the promise of New Testament believers is that we will be resurrected with perfect bodies, and that is untainted by sin, as the Savior appeared to the apostles and to whom he presented himself to in resurrected form. Now, those who are damned to hell do not have the same privilege or prerogative. Their bodies instantly evaporate in the lake of fire, and then their immortal soul spends an eternity in essential solitude. But he also alludes to the Redeemer. Many Christian scholars interpret this Christologically, an allusion of the Messiah to come. Now, again, we don't have any accurate or reliable chronological framework of Job, but he is very much a pioneer in what became tenets of the Jewish and Christian tradition. And after my skin has been struck off, then in my flesh I shall see Eloha. So he has an accurate conception that his body, even as it perishes on the earth, will be resurrected and able to stand before Eloha. And according to the merits of the person, they either dwell there for eternity or are cast out to hell. Whom I myself shall see on my side, and not a stranger. My kidneys have failed within me. So he's feeling estranged from the object of his faith in whom he had invested his entire life and livelihood towards. And yet he has faith that whatever is besetting him on earth now will not haunt him for an eternity. If you say, why do we persecute him? Seeing the root of the matter has been found in me. Fear the sword yourself, for wrath is the punishment of the sword, so that you know there is a judgment. So Job is turning the tables on sorts. He's assuming the aggressive initiative in the debate, in the dialogue from the friends. Remember, the narrative, plenary narrative, is an exchange of monologues, or read as monologues, but they were in fact dialogues. And he's telling them that if he is to be judged, so too must they, because Elohim is absolutely fair, and the gift of life that he trusts us with demands an accounting, and he reserves the right to welcome us in his loving arms for an eternal fellowship or cast us to hell, and rightly so. And that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.